Flash Route. Chapter 1. The Flash over Nevada. Jason Dunham stood at the edge of the visitor group with his hands in his jacket pockets, studying Dugway Proving Ground the way a mechanic studies an engine that someone else insists is running perfectly. The morning air was dry enough that every breath carried the faint taste of dust and chemicals, the smell of a place where things were burned, tested, and buried without explanation. The group of civilians, about a dozen contractors, academics, and defense consultants, clustered around a young Army lieutenant who was smiling with the tight professionalism of someone reciting a script he had memorized and wished he didn't have to repeat again. Behind them stretched a wide concrete courtyard bordered by squat government buildings painted the color of old sand. Everything about the place looked intentionally dull. Jason knew that trick. If a base looked boring enough, most people stopped asking questions. "Welcome to Dugway Proving Ground," the lieutenant said, gesturing toward the distant flats where low hangars and antenna towers shimmered in the desert heat. As many of you know, Dugway supports a wide range of defensive research and testing programs vital to national security. He kept talking, something about environmental monitoring and safety protocols, but Jason wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had settled on a building 200 yards away, a wide hangar with thick concrete blast shutters installed across the upper windows. Those shutters were new. He could tell from the bolts. The metal still had the bright color of freshly machined steel. You didn't install blast shutters like that unless you expected something violent to happen nearby, or inside. "Those towers aren't for weather telemetry," a woman said beside him. Jason glanced over. Sherry Wilde had stepped slightly away from the group, looking past the lieutenant toward 3 tall antenna structures rising behind another cluster of buildings. They were arranged in a precise triangular pattern, each one bristling with dishes and narrow directional transmitters. Her brow furrowed as she studied them. "Weather telemetry towers don't need that kind of directional phasing," she said quietly. Jason shrugged. "You sound disappointed." "I'm not disappointed," she replied. "I'm curious." She stepped closer to the lieutenant as he paused for questions. "Those antenna arrays back there," she said. "What exactly are they monitoring?" The lieutenant didn't even look toward the towers. "Standard communications infrastructure," he said smoothly. "Redundant systems for range operations." Sherry tilted her head. "Triangulated arrays usually mean signal acquisition." The lieutenant smiled wider, but the smile had tightened at the edges. "I assure you they support routine range communications." Jason watched the exchange with mild amusement. Sherry didn't look like the type to accept routine answers. A few feet away, another member of the tour group stood with his hands clasped neatly behind his back, watching the entire conversation without speaking. Ross Lerner had the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime standing in briefings and conference rooms. His dark jacket looked expensive without being flashy, and his expression was calm enough that it almost disappeared into the background. But his eyes moved constantly, measuring distances, noticing reactions, quietly cataloging everything around him. When Sherry stepped back beside Jason again, Ross spoke for the first time. "You noticed the tower alignment quickly," he said in a mild voice. Sherry looked at him. "Occupational habit. Signals research?" Ross asked. She studied him a moment before nodding. "Something like that." Jason chuckled softly. "You two planning to ruin the tour before it even starts?" Sherry smiled faintly. "I just like knowing what I'm looking at." Jason glanced again toward the hangar with the blast shutters, then across the wide desert beyond the base perimeter. Dugway was built in the middle of nowhere for a reason. Whatever happened here was meant to stay far away from cities and witnesses. But even for a place like this, something felt off. The soldiers stationed around the courtyard weren't relaxed. Their heads moved too often, scanning the sky and the distant ridges. One of them stood near a parked Humvee with a rifle held across his chest instead of slung casually like it should have been during a civilian visit. Jason leaned slightly closer to Sherry. "You ever get the feeling you showed up on the wrong day?" he asked quietly. Sherry studied the empty desert stretching beyond the fences for a moment before answering. "Places like this always make me uneasy," she said. Jason glanced at her. "Why?" Sherry shrugged slightly, because people build facilities like Dugway when they're afraid something dangerous might get out. Jason followed her gaze toward the distant flats. Out of where? Sherry thought about that for a moment. I'm not sure, she said. Sometimes I think places like this exist because someone is afraid something dangerous might already be out, listening. The lieutenant clapped his hands once in a polite attempt to gather everyone's attention again and began guiding the group across the concrete courtyard toward a line of utility vehicles waiting along the edge of the complex. The civilians drifted after him in loose formation, their footsteps echoing faintly across the open space as a dry desert wind pushed dust along the pavement in thin, twisting ribbons. Jason walked near the back of the group, his eyes roaming freely across the base. Dugway had the look of a place built in layers, old concrete structures from the Cold War sitting beside newer steel-sided buildings, communication towers rising above them like thin skeletal trees. The lieutenant kept talking about environmental containment zones and historical testing ranges, but his path through the compound felt oddly choreographed. Every time someone's gaze drifted toward a particular building, he gently redirected the group's movement away from it without appearing obvious. Jason noticed the pattern within minutes. They passed a large maintenance garage with reinforced vehicle doors thick enough to stop a missile blast. The building next to it had a fresh set of external air filtration units installed along the roofline, the kind designed for sealed environments. That's new, Jason muttered under his breath as he walked past. Sherry followed his gaze. You can tell? Bolts haven't rusted yet, Jason said. Give it 6 months and they'll blend right in. Sherry glanced again toward the triangular antenna towers in the distance. Now that they were closer, the details were clearer. Each tower carried multiple directional dishes arranged in carefully calculated angles, with fiber conduit lines running down their bases into underground access ports. The design was unmistakable to her. Those aren't for base radios, she said quietly. Jason raised an eyebrow. What are they? Signal acquisition arrays, she replied. You use triangulated alignment like that to isolate transmissions from a wide field. Jason smirked faintly. You sound like you've seen them before. Sherry didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted her eyes to follow the tower's directional orientation across the sky. Yes, she said finally. Something like them. Ahead of them, Ross Lerner had fallen into step beside the lieutenant. His voice was calm and conversational, but Jason noticed the lieutenant's shoulders tightening as the man spoke. Dugway has been operational since World War II, Ross said. That's a remarkable length of time for a testing facility. I imagine the archive of programs here must be extensive. The lieutenant nodded carefully. Many historical projects, yes. Chemical defense programs mostly, Ross continued mildly. Though I understand Dugway also supported certain experimental containment initiatives in the late 20th century. The lieutenant stopped walking for a half-second before continuing forward again. Those records remain classified, he said. Ross smiled politely. Of course. The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered like static in the air. As the group approached the row of vehicles, a deep roar suddenly swept across the sky. Jason instinctively looked up. 2 fighter jets tore across the desert horizon at high altitude, their engines trailing thunder that rolled across the flats like distant artillery. Another pair followed seconds later, streaking westward in tight formation. Sherry shaded her eyes to watch them disappear into the pale blue sky. That seems like a lot of air traffic for a weapons range tour, she said. Jason nodded slowly. Dugway sat beneath controlled airspace. Civilian aircraft rarely passed anywhere near it, and even military flights were usually scheduled well in advance. But the jets overhead weren't cruising casually. They were moving fast, purposefully. A third formation thundered across the sky, this one even higher, contrails cutting long white scars through the upper atmosphere as they raced toward Nevada. The lieutenant pretended not to notice. He opened the door of the nearest transport van and gestured for the group to climb inside. Next stop, he said brightly, one of Dugway's historical testing facilities. Jason lingered beside the vehicle for a moment longer, watching the empty horizon where the jets had disappeared. Something about their direction bothered him. Every single aircraft had been heading west. When he finally climbed into the van, Ross Lerner was already seated near the back, gazing calmly out the opposite window as if listening to something only he could hear. The van rolled slowly along a wide concrete access road that cut through the heart of the base, its tires humming against the pavement as the group passed rows of storage bunkers and low administrative buildings. Dust drifted lazily across the desert beyond the perimeter fences, and for a few minutes the tour settled into the quiet rhythm of controlled government routine. The lieutenant sat in the passenger seat up front, still explaining Dugway's safety procedures with the calm cadence of someone determined to keep everything ordinary. Jason leaned back against the window beside Sherry, watching the base slide past outside. He counted guard towers without really meaning to. 3 along the outer fence line, another near the vehicle depot, every tower manned, every soldier alert. That wasn't normal for a guided tour. Then the first siren began to wail. The sound rose from somewhere deep inside the base, a long mechanical howl that echoed across the desert like a warning horn from another century. It lasted several seconds before fading. A second later, another siren answered it from the far side of the compound. The lieutenant cleared his throat and turned slightly in his seat. "Routine drill," he said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." But outside the van, the reaction told a different story. Soldiers began emerging from buildings at a run. A pair of Humvees roared across an intersection ahead of them, tires screeching as they accelerated toward the western perimeter. Jason sat up straighter. "That's not a drill," he murmured. Sherry leaned forward to peer through the windshield. The access road ahead was suddenly crowded with vehicles moving in every direction. Transport trucks, armored carriers, even a fuel tanker racing past with its hazard lights flashing. Overhead, the distant rumble of aircraft engines grew louder again. Ross Lerner remained perfectly still in his seat. His eyes had drifted toward the van's dashboard where a small mounted radio unit suddenly burst to life with overlapping voices. "Repeat. Confirm alert status. NORAD verification pending. Possible detonation." The lieutenant lunged forward and snapped the radio off. His calm expression had vanished. "Communication issue," he said sharply, though no one had asked. Jason pulled his phone from his pocket and checked the signal indicator. The bars flickered once, then vanished completely. Around the van, several other members of the tour group began checking their own devices with confused frowns. "No service," one of them muttered. Sherry looked down at her screen as well. The signal icon blinked twice before disappearing entirely. Even the GPS indicator froze. Jason slowly returned the phone to his pocket. "They just killed every network on the base," he said quietly. The van slowed as another convoy of military vehicles raced across the intersection ahead. Soldiers inside them were shouting into radios, their faces tense beneath their helmets. The lieutenant turned around in his seat, forcing another thin smile. "Again," he said, his voice tight. "Routine emergency preparedness exercise." Jason met Sherry's eyes across the narrow seat. Neither of them believed that for a second. At the back of the van, Ross Lerner finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost thoughtful. "No," he said quietly. "I don't believe it is." The van had barely rolled another 100 yards when the driver suddenly braked hard enough that several passengers lurched forward in their seats. Ahead of them, 2 soldiers had run into the roadway, waving both arms and shouting something the glass muffled into frantic shapes of sound. The lieutenant leaned halfway out the passenger door and barked a question that never finished leaving his mouth. Somewhere above the buildings to their left, another voice began yelling from a rooftop observation platform. The words carried clearly through the dry desert air. "Look west! Look west!" The entire group turned instinctively toward the horizon. At first, Jason thought the sun had broken through a cloud bank, though the sky had been perfectly clear all morning. Then the light grew brighter, much brighter. A massive bloom of white brilliance rose beyond the distant mountain ridges far to the west, expanding upward in a silent sphere so bright it erased the color from the desert landscape. For one suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The light was wrong, too large, too sudden, too far above the ground to be anything natural. Sherry felt her stomach drop even before the shape began to change. The glowing sphere stretched upward, boiling into a towering column of light that punched into the upper atmosphere like a pillar of burning glass. Someone inside the van whispered, "What the hell?" Then the ground shivered. It was subtle at first, a low vibration that rippled through the pavement and the metal frame of the vehicle. Jason felt it through the soles of his boots and knew instantly what he was looking at. His voice came out flat and quiet. "That's not a test." Radios exploded into life all across the compound, the air filled with overlapping shouts from soldiers scrambling between vehicles. "Confirm visual detonation. Satellite confirmation pending. God, that's Nevada." Sherry stared at the impossible column of light rising above the distant horizon. The shape was still growing, swelling outward as darker clouds began forming beneath it. Her mind struggled to assemble the image into something real. Nuclear detonations were something she had only ever seen in archival footage. Grainy, black and white film from another era. Yet the shape on the horizon matched those old images perfectly. Ross Lerner had not moved at all. His eyes remained fixed on the distant explosion, his expression calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. Jason tore his gaze away from the horizon and began scanning the surrounding buildings instead. "We need to get underground," he said. The moment Jason spoke, the entire base erupted into motion. Sirens began howling again, louder this time, their rising wail echoing across the desert like a mechanical scream. Soldiers sprinted across the courtyard ahead of the van while loudspeakers mounted on nearby buildings crackled to life with overlapping emergency announcements. "All personnel initiate immediate lockdown procedures. Repeat, immediate lockdown procedures." A helicopter thundered overhead so low the van rocked in its wake, its rotors chopping violently at the dry air as it banked toward the western perimeter. Another helicopter followed seconds later, racing across the compound with a dangling sensor array swaying beneath its belly. The lieutenant shoved open the van door and jumped onto the pavement. "Everyone out," he shouted. The civilians spilled from the vehicle in a confused cluster, staring toward the blazing horizon where the distant column of smoke was already spreading into a massive dark canopy high in the atmosphere. Soldiers rushed past them carrying rifles and sealed equipment cases. One of them nearly collided with Jason before shouting into his shoulder radio, "Possible second strike window." Another voice barked back through the speaker in a burst of static. "NORAD still verifying source." The lieutenant grabbed a bullhorn from the van's side compartment and began shouting directions toward a concrete shelter building across the courtyard. "All civilians move to that structure immediately." The group began shuffling across the pavement, but the orderly tour formation had dissolved into confusion. People pushed past one another, some still staring toward the distant explosion, while others fumbled with their phones despite the dead networks. Jason walked quickly beside Cherie, keeping his eyes on the soldiers moving around them. Something about the pattern of their movement didn't feel coordinated. Too many conflicting instructions, too many radios shouting at once. "They don't know what just happened," Cherie said quietly. Jason nodded once. Ahead of them, the shelter building's heavy steel doors were being dragged open by a pair of soldiers. Civilians began crowding toward the entrance. Jason was about to follow when a different group of armed personnel rushed across the courtyard from the opposite direction, shouting new instructions. "Negative on that shelter," one of them yelled. "Command says redirect to—" The rest of his words vanished beneath the rising sirens. The civilians hesitated, unsure which direction to follow. In that moment of confusion, the group fractured completely. Some people continued toward the shelter doors, while others turned toward a different building where another soldier was waving frantically. Jason stopped walking. He hated situations where no one seemed to know who was actually in charge. When he looked around again, half the tour group had already vanished inside the shelter structure. The rest were scattering across the compound under conflicting orders. Sherry stood beside him, breathing slowly, her eyes fixed on the enormous cloud spreading across the western sky. "Jason," she said quietly. He followed her gaze. The cloud had begun to form the unmistakable shape of a mushroom rising miles into the upper atmosphere. Before he could respond, a firm hand grabbed his arm. The man gripping Jason's arm wore the dark uniform of a Dugway security officer, though his collar insignia marked him as a captain. His face was pale beneath the desert sun, and sweat glistened along his hairline despite the dry air. "You three," he said sharply, pulling Jason, Sherry, and Ross away from the drifting crowd. "Come with me." Jason instinctively resisted the motion. "Where?" The captain ignored the question. His eyes had locked onto Ross Lerner with sudden recognition. "Mr. Lerner," he said under his breath. Ross met his gaze calmly. "Captain." The brief exchange carried the tone of two people who had expected to meet under very different circumstances. The captain turned immediately and began striding toward a nearby administrative building without waiting for their agreement. "Move!" he snapped. Jason hesitated only a second before following. The tone of the man's voice carried the unmistakable urgency of someone who understood exactly how bad the situation was becoming. Sherry hurried beside him while Ross walked several steps behind, his expression thoughtful and unreadable. The captain shoved through a side door and led them down a narrow hallway lined with locked offices. The sounds of the chaotic bass outside faded quickly as the door slammed shut behind them. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while the captain moved briskly toward the end of the corridor. Jason noticed a keypad security lock beside the final door. The captain punched in a code without slowing. The door opened onto a small maintenance room filled with electrical panels and storage crates. "Okay," Jason said, planting his boots on the concrete floor. "Someone want to explain what's happening?" The captain didn't answer. Instead, he knelt beside a square metal panel set flush into the floor. With a quick twist of a recessed handle, he lifted the hatch upward on hidden hinges. A ladder descended into darkness below. Cool air drifted upward from the opening, carrying the faint metallic smell of underground machinery. Sherry stepped closer, staring into the black shaft. "What is this?" Jason asked. The captain looked up at them with an expression that had lost every trace of official composure. "Your only chance of getting off this base alive," he said. Jason folded his arms. "Start talking." The captain shook his head. "There isn't time." He pointed down the ladder. "Follow that corridor east and do not stop moving." Ross finally spoke. "How far does it run?" The captain hesitated. "Far enough." Jason studied the man's face for several seconds, searching for any sign this was a mistake. What he saw instead was raw fear. The captain stood abruptly and stepped aside from the hatch. "Down," he said. One by one they climbed the ladder into the darkness below. Jason reached the bottom first, boots landing on cold steel flooring inside a narrow underground tunnel lit by dim emergency lights. Sherry descended after him, followed by Ross. The captain's face appeared above them for a final moment in the square opening. His eyes locked onto Ross again. "They already know," he said quietly. Then the hatch slammed shut. Heavy locking bolts slid into place above them with a final metallic thud. The light from the corridor vanished. Jason, Sherry, and Ross stood alone in the dim glow of the tunnel as the distant sirens of Dugway howled faintly through the ceiling overhead. Chapter 2. The Ash Root. Jason stood for a moment beneath the sealed hatch, letting his eyes adjust to the dim red emergency lights that stretched down the tunnel like a fading trail of embers disappearing into the distance. The corridor was enormous, at least 20 feet wide. The ceiling arched overhead with thick steel reinforcement ribs bolted into the concrete walls. The air felt cool and dry, carrying the faint mechanical smell of lubricants and electrical insulation. Running directly through the center of the floor were a pair of steel rails embedded in a narrow trench, the kind used for heavy transport carts or maintenance trams. Jason crouched beside them, brushing a finger along the metal. The rail surface was polished smooth from long use. "This isn't a bunker hallway," he said quietly, standing again and looking down the endless corridor. Sherry turned slowly in place, her eyes tracking the repeating pattern of conduit pipes and sealed access doors lining the walls every 50 feet. "No," she agreed. "It's infrastructure." Ross Lerner had not moved from the base of the ladder. He stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, studying the tunnel with the thoughtful expression of someone who had just encountered something both familiar and deeply inconvenient. Jason glanced at him. "You knew this was down here." Ross took a slow breath. "I suspected Dugway maintained certain underground transport corridors." Jason gave a short laugh. "Transport corridors to where?" Ross hesitated just long enough to make the answer obvious. Then he said it anyway. "Area 51. The words settled into the tunnel with a strange weight. Cherie blinked at him. "You're joking." Ross shook his head gently. "No." Jason crouched beside the steel rail line running down the center of the tunnel and brushed a finger across the polished metal, the surface worn smooth by years of use. "Whatever this thing is," he said quietly, "it's been running a long time." Cherie studied the dim corridor stretching into the distance, the red emergency lights fading one by one into darkness. "Does it have a name?" Ross hesitated before nodding toward a faded stencil painted on the wall beside the track. The letters were nearly worn away, but they were still barely readable. "Ash Root." Jason frowned. "That's a strange name for a tunnel." Ross looked down the corridor, disappearing into shadow. "It wasn't meant to describe the tunnel." Jason glanced at him. "Then what was it describing?" Ross didn't answer, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch down the length of the corridor itself, as though the tunnel were leading somewhere far beyond the desert above them. Dugway Proving Ground sat in Utah. Area 51 lay deep inside Nevada. The distance between them stretched across hundreds of miles of empty land. "You're telling me there's a tunnel running from here all the way to Groom Lake?" Jason said slowly. Ross offered a small shrug. "Certain classified projects require secure logistical pathways." Sherry walked to one of the heavy steel doors lining the wall and examined the thick locking wheel mounted at its center. A faded number had been stenciled above it in black paint. Station 3A. "This isn't just logistics," she said quietly. "This is a transit system." Jason began walking down the tunnel, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor panels. "Well," he said over his shoulder, "our friend upstairs told us to go east." Sherry and Ross followed. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, disappearing into a hazy line of dim lights far in the distance. Somewhere deep within the tunnel system, a faint mechanical hum vibrated through the walls, like the distant heartbeat of some buried machine still running long after everyone had forgotten why it existed. Their footsteps echoed steadily through the corridor as they moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound bouncing off the curved walls and returning in faint, distorted whispers that made the passage feel even larger than it already was. The emergency lights glowed a dull red every 20 feet along the ceiling, each one casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like dark bars, sliding beneath their boots as they walked. After several minutes, the tunnel widened suddenly into a broad chamber where the rail line split into multiple tracks branching across a wide concrete platform. Jason slowed immediately. The space looked like an underground train station carved into the bedrock beneath the desert. A long loading platform ran along one side, with thick steel support pillars rising toward the ceiling far above. An empty tram sat parked on the nearest track, its sleek metal body coated with a thin layer of dust that suggested it had not moved in quite some time. Sherry stepped onto the platform, her eyes scanning the faded signage mounted on the far wall. "Station 4C, she read aloud. Beneath the number were several directional arrows labeled with short-coded abbreviations. DG-S, Train-A, Nevada-7. None of the designations meant anything obvious. Jason ran his hand along the tram's exterior. The vehicle was built like a bullet train, smooth armored plating, sealed windows, reinforced with internal mesh. "You don't build something like this unless you expect serious traffic," he said. Ross walked slowly along the platform, studying the signage with quiet concentration. "This tunnel system has existed longer than most people realize," he said. Sherry glanced at him. "How long?" Ross didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to a large, wall-mounted map protected behind a sheet of cloudy glass. Most of the map had faded with age, but the thick branching lines of the tunnel network were still faintly visible beneath the grime. They stretched across the desert in multiple directions like a buried circulatory system. Jason followed his gaze. "That's a lot bigger than Dugway and Area 51. Ross nodded once. "Yes." Sherry leaned closer to the glass, tracing one of the faint lines with her finger. "Some of these routes go far beyond Nevada." Jason folded his arms. Government always did like building roads nobody's supposed to know about. Ross said nothing, but his silence carried the uncomfortable weight of agreement. They left the empty station behind and returned to the narrower stretch of tunnel beyond it, the dim red lights continuing their endless procession overhead as the corridor stretched forward into shadow. The distant mechanical hum seemed slightly louder here, vibrating faintly through the rails beneath their feet. Jason walked several steps ahead of the others now, his attention shifting automatically into the alert rhythm he had learned years earlier in far more dangerous places. Every few seconds he paused to listen, letting the tunnel's echoes settle around him. After several minutes, he stopped completely. Sherry nearly bumped into his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked. Jason held up one hand for silence. The tunnel fell still again except for the faint electrical buzz of the overhead lights. Then it came, a soft metallic sound echoing from somewhere ahead. A scrape. Then another, like something brushing lightly against steel. Sherry frowned. "You hear that?" Jason nodded slowly. Ross had stopped several steps behind them, his expression tightening as the sound repeated faintly through the corridor. "Maintenance system," Ross said quickly. Jason didn't move. "Maintenance systems don't move like that." The scraping sound came again, slightly louder now. Something was definitely moving farther down the tunnel beyond the next bend. Sherry felt a strange pressure ripple across her thoughts, like the faint echo of a voice just outside hearing range. She blinked and rubbed her temple. "That's odd," she murmured. Jason glanced back at her. "What?" Sherry hesitated. "Nothing." But the strange sensation lingered, pressing gently at the edge of her awareness like a question waiting to be asked. Jason slowly reached inside his jacket and pulled out the compact flashlight clipped to his belt. The beam sliced through the dim red glow as he stepped forward cautiously toward the curve in the tunnel ahead. The scraping sound had stopped now, leaving the corridor strangely silent again. Sherry followed close behind him, her eyes fixed on the shadows where the tunnel bent out of sight. Ross remained several steps back, his posture rigid. Jason rounded the corner first. The flashlight beam swept across the steel walls and caught something moving. The shape vanished instantly into the darkness beyond the next stretch of tunnel, but Jason saw enough to freeze in place. It had been tall, much taller than a human, thin limbs bending at unfamiliar angles. Jason lowered the flashlight slightly. "We're not alone down here," he said quietly. Sherry stepped beside him just as the strange pressure inside her head surged suddenly stronger. For a split second, the world around her seemed to blur, and then something else filled her mind entirely. A cascade of images burst across her thoughts like fragments of memory that didn't belong to her. A narrow white room filled with blinding lights, metal restraints, sharp instruments glinting beneath observation windows. Panic, pain, a desperate need to escape. Sherry staggered backward, grabbing Jason's arm. Something just... The images shifted again, forming a single overwhelming emotion that flooded her mind with crystal clarity. Fear. Not her fear, someone else's. And then a final image appeared. 3 tall figures hiding in the shadows farther down the tunnel, watching the humans with wide reflective eyes. Sherry gasped and clutched her head. "Jason," she whispered. "They're scared." Chapter 3. The Prisoners. Jason kept one hand firmly on the flashlight while the other hovered near the heavy wrench he had pulled from a maintenance rack back at the tram station. The tunnel ahead curved slightly to the left, and the beam of light cut across the steel wall until it caught movement again. This time the shapes did not vanish. They stepped slowly into the dim red glow of the emergency lights, their bodies tall and unnervingly slender, their limbs bending with a fluid motion that looked almost boneless compared to human joints. Sherry drew in a slow breath as she saw them clearly for the first time. Their skin had a faint, translucent sheen that shifted subtly as they moved, like oil spreading across the surface of water. Their heads were elongated, their eyes large and reflective in the low light, catching the beam of Jason's flashlight and throwing it back in pale flashes. Jason instinctively raised the wrench slightly higher. The three figures stopped immediately, holding perfectly still in the middle of the tunnel. None of them made a sound. Ross had stepped back several paces behind Jason and Sherry, and the expression on his face had changed completely. The calm composure he had maintained since entering the tunnel had cracked into something far closer to shock. "No," he whispered under his breath. Jason heard him and glanced back briefly. "You know what those things are?" Ross did not answer right away. His eyes remained locked on the figures standing in the tunnel. Sherry felt the pressure in her mind again. Stronger now, no longer just a faint ripple, but a steady presence, pressing gently against her thoughts. The three beings watched them without moving, their eyes wide and bright in the dim red lighting, as if trying to decide whether the humans were a threat. One of them shifted slightly forward, its long fingers uncurling slowly at its sides. Sherry felt the contact again, a sudden rush of images sliding through her mind like fragments of someone else's memory. Sherry's knees weakened as the images flooded her thoughts, so vivid they briefly pushed the tunnel around her into the background. She saw a long white chamber lit by harsh surgical lights. Metal restraints clamped around thin limbs, figures in protective suits moving around observation tables, instruments descending slowly toward exposed skin while bright monitors flickered along the walls. Pain followed the images, sharp, disorienting waves of it that pulsed through her mind like echoes of something endured for years. Sherry staggered slightly as the images faded, but one final impression lingered in her mind longer than the others. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far colder. A quiet certainty the aliens carried like a warning carved into memory. The prison they had built had never been meant to hold a place. It had been meant to hold a mind. Then Sherry looked at Jason. "They were prisoners," she said quietly. Jason grabbed her arm immediately. "Hey, what's happening?" Sherry struggled to focus on his voice as another wave of images rolled through her thoughts. A narrow containment cell, a thick glass barrier, armed guards standing beyond it. Then a final image burned through the rest with desperate urgency. The three tall beings standing in the tunnel exactly as they were now, watching the humans with cautious fear. Sherry blinked hard, forcing the visions to fade. When she looked up again, the nearest alien had taken another careful step forward. Its large reflective eyes were fixed entirely on her. The pressure inside her mind returned, but this time it felt more controlled. Not overwhelming, almost tentative. A question. Sherry swallowed and spoke softly without taking her eyes off the being. "They're not attacking," she said. Jason glanced between her and the figures. "You sure about that?" Sherry nodded slowly. "They're communicating." Ross finally stepped closer again, his face pale beneath the emergency lighting. "That shouldn't be possible," he said quietly. Sherry looked at him sharply. "You knew about them." Ross did not deny it. His gaze remained locked on the three beings standing motionless in the tunnel. "Yes," he said. "I did." Jason lowered the wrench slightly but did not relax his stance. "You're telling me those things came from Area 51? Ross nodded slowly. "They were contained there." Jason let out a short breath that sounded half like a laugh. "Contained," he repeated. Sherry glanced between them. "You mean imprisoned?" Ross hesitated before answering. Yes. Jason rubbed his jaw and looked back at the aliens standing in the tunnel. And now they're down here with us. As if responding to the tension in his voice, another wave of telepathic contact reached Sherry's mind. This time the images came more slowly, carefully assembled as if the beings were learning how to communicate with her more clearly. She saw a long corridor of white containment rooms stretching beneath desert rock, armed guards moving through observation decks. The same three beings confined behind thick, transparent barriers while human researchers studied them from the other side. Sherry felt their emotions layered beneath the images, years of confusion, isolation, and growing desperation. They were prisoners, she said quietly. Jason nodded once. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. Ross exhaled slowly. Their containment was considered necessary. Jason shot him a look. Necessary for who? Ross didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the beings in the tunnel, and for the first time since the encounter began, something like genuine uncertainty flickered across his face. Sherry felt the next message coming before it fully formed. The pressure inside her thoughts sharpened suddenly, and the images arrived with a surge of urgency that made her stagger again. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead in her mind's eye, dark corridors branching away into deeper sections of the underground network. Massive reinforced doors sealed with warning markings she could not understand. Behind those doors, something moved. Not a creature exactly, more like a presence spreading slowly through the corridors like smoke creeping beneath a door. The emotion attached to the image was pure terror. Sherry's eyes widened as the vision snapped away. Jason caught her shoulders. What did they show you? She looked back at the three beings standing in the dim red tunnel light. Their large eyes remained fixed on her, waiting. They're not just escaping, she said slowly. Jason frowned. Then what are they doing? Sherry took a breath, trying to steady the echo of fear still rippling through her thoughts. They're running, she said, from something deeper in this tunnel. Chapter 4. Containment Protocol. The echo of Sherry's words had barely faded when a distant crack of gunfire snapped through the tunnel like a whip. The sound carried unnaturally well through the long metal corridor, ricocheting off the curved ceiling until it became a jagged chorus of overlapping reports that faded slowly into the distance behind them. Jason's head turned instantly toward the direction they had come from. That's not good, he muttered. Another burst followed a few seconds later, shorter this time, more controlled. Ross's eyes narrowed. That's a containment team. Jason glanced back at him sharply. Containment for what? Ross didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, listening to the faint echoes rolling down the tunnel. Then the sound of voices arrived through the same corridor, distorted by distance but still recognizable as radio transmissions bouncing through the underground structure. Movement confirmed near Station 4C. Subjects may have assistance. Authorization granted for lethal containment. Jason's grip tightened around the wrench in his hand. Subjects, he repeated quietly. Sherry looked toward the three aliens still standing several yards away. Their posture had changed the moment the gunfire began. Their tall bodies had stiffened, and the faint shimmering patterns across their skin darkened subtly as if reacting to the sudden threat. One of them turned its head sharply toward the distant sounds of pursuit. Sherry felt the next surge of telepathic contact rush into her thoughts. This time the images came with urgency bordering on panic. Armed soldiers moving through sterile corridors, heavy containment doors slamming shut, blinding lights flooding observation chambers. She staggered slightly as the emotion behind the images hit her full force. They are coming. The message formed in her mind clearly now. Not just images, actual structure beginning to take shape within the telepathic contact. Jason noticed her expression change. Sherry? She looked at him, breathing faster. Security teams, she said, from the other end of the tunnel. Ross nodded grimly. Area 51. The distant radio chatter grew clearer as it bounced repeatedly along the metal corridor. "Thermal signatures detected," one voice reported through a burst of static. "3 confirmed targets." Another voice cut in, sharper and colder. "No civilian interference authorized. Repeat, no witnesses." Jason's jaw tightened. "That's comforting." Sherry glanced at Ross. "They're talking about killing us." Ross's expression remained tight, but controlled. "The security teams are operating under containment protocol." Jason gave him a hard look. "You keep saying that like it makes sense." Another radio voice crackled through the tunnel. "Station access grid shows movement beyond 4C. Pursuit team advancing." The aliens reacted instantly. All 3 turned toward the deeper section of tunnel ahead, their long limbs shifting into a fluid running posture that looked almost insect-like in its efficiency. Sherry felt another pulse of communication flood into her thoughts. This time the images came faster, sharper, maps of the tunnel network branching through the earth like veins, highlighted pathways flashing in urgent sequence. A single direction pulsed brighter than the rest. "Forward." Sherry swallowed. "They want us to go with them." Jason raised an eyebrow. "They didn't exactly invite us." Sherry shook her head. "It's not that." She pressed a hand against her temple again as another image formed, armed soldiers moving through the corridor behind them, weapons raised. "If we stay here," she said quietly, "the security teams will find us first." Jason looked back down the tunnel they had come from. The distant echoes of boots and radio chatter were growing steadily louder. Jason didn't argue further. "Then we move," he said simply. The 3 aliens were already gliding down the tunnel ahead of them, their long limbs carrying them forward with surprising speed, while barely making a sound against the metal floor. Jason broke into a run after them, Sherry and Ross following close behind. The emergency lights streaked past overhead in a red blur as their footsteps thundered through the corridor. Sherry felt the alien presence in her mind growing stronger with each step. Their thoughts moved quickly now, projecting rapid bursts of information directly into her awareness. She saw branching tunnel routes flashing through her mind like a living map, sections of the underground network lighting up as the aliens calculated their escape path. Jason's breathing grew heavier as they ran. "How far does this thing go?" he asked between strides. Ross answered without slowing. "Hundreds of miles." Jason glanced sideways at him. "You serious?" Ross nodded once. "The system connects multiple facilities." Sherry felt a sudden spike of tension ripple through the alien minds. The mental map in her thoughts shifted abruptly as several tunnel routes went dark. Heavy blast doors slamming shut, access corridors sealing automatically. She stumbled slightly as the realization hit her. "They're locking sections of the tunnel," she said. Ross's expression tightened immediately. "Containment lockdown." Jason grunted. "Meaning?" Ross looked ahead into the dim corridor. "Meaning the security teams may already be trying to trap us inside." The aliens slowed abruptly near a junction where a smaller passage branched off from the main rail corridor. Without hesitation, they slipped into the side passage. Jason followed them inside and immediately noticed the difference. The maintenance corridor was much narrower than the main tunnel, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls were rough concrete instead of reinforced steel, and the overhead lights flickered weakly through dusty protective cages. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, some of them dripping slowly onto the floor below. "This section's older," Jason said quietly. Sherry nodded as she studied the cracked walls. "Much older." Ross stepped through the junction behind them and looked back toward the main tunnel before following deeper into the side corridor. "These service branches were part of the earliest construction phases," he said. Jason glanced at him. "Earliest as in how early?" Ross hesitated briefly. "Cold War." Sherry felt the alien minds flare again with nervous energy. Their mental signals shifted direction, urging the humans forward down the dim maintenance passage. Jason tightened his grip on the wrench again and continued moving. Behind them, Faint echoes of the pursuing security teams drifted through the distant tunnel. The hunters were still coming. The maintenance corridor twisted sharply through the bedrock beneath the desert, its cracked concrete walls narrowing as the group pushed deeper into the older section of the underground complex. The faint hum that had filled the main tunnel was gone here, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the slow drip of condensation from the aging pipes overhead. Jason kept moving at a steady pace, but Sherry began to feel a strange sensation building at the edge of her awareness. At first, she thought it was simply the lingering echo of the alien's telepathic contact. Then the feeling changed. It was colder, sharper, like a whisper pressing against the back of her mind from somewhere far ahead in the darkness. She slowed slightly. The three aliens reacted immediately. All of them stopped and turned back toward her at once. Their eyes widened. The emotion that surged through Sherry's mind this time was unmistakable. Not caution, not curiosity, pure, overwhelming dread. Jason noticed her expression tighten. "What now?" he asked quietly. Sherry stared down the dark corridor ahead of them. "They're not just afraid of the soldiers," she said slowly. Jason frowned. "Then what are they afraid of?" Sherry swallowed hard as the alien presence in her mind recoiled violently from something unseen farther down the tunnel. "Something else is down here," she said. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Wing. The narrow maintenance passage finally widened into a larger chamber carved directly into the surrounding bedrock. Jason slowed immediately as the group stepped out of the cramped corridor into the broader space. The change in construction was obvious. The walls here were raw, poured concrete reinforced with thick steel braces that had long since begun to rust along the edges. Faded yellow hazard lines ran along the floor, half worn away by years of use. Overhead lights hung from thick chains instead of recessed mounts, their dim glow revealing rows of sealed doors stretching down both sides of the chamber. Each door carried a small metal placard bolted to its surface, though most of the lettering had faded with time. Jason ran a hand along the nearest wall and felt the rough texture of concrete that had been poured generations earlier. "This place is ancient," he muttered. Ross stepped beside him, studying the structure with quiet recognition. "Not ancient," he said, "just forgotten." Sherry moved slowly through the chamber, her eyes drifting across the old warning placards mounted beside the doors. Some of them carried familiar biohazard symbols, though the designs looked slightly different from modern versions. Others displayed markings she didn't recognize at all, strange geometric hazard symbols printed in faded black ink. The three aliens stood close together near the corridor entrance, their tall forms rigid as they scanned the chamber. Their unease was obvious now. Sherry felt it pulsing faintly through her mind like distant thunder. Jason glanced back at them. "They don't like this place." Ross nodded slowly. "Neither do I." Jason approached the nearest sealed door and gripped the large locking wheel mounted at its center. The metal groaned softly as he turned it. After a moment, the door swung inward with a long, scraping sound that echoed through the chamber. The room beyond looked like a laboratory frozen in time. Stainless steel work tables stood in neat rows beneath dusty overhead lights. Glass containers lined the shelves along the walls, many of them filled with cloudy chemical solution that had slowly yellowed with age. Jason stepped carefully inside. "Nobody's been down here in a long time," he said. Sherry followed him, her eyes scanning the equipment with growing unease. Several of the glass containers held preserved biological samples, small tissue fragments suspended in fluid, each one labeled with faded identification tags. Some looked vaguely animal in origin. Others did not resemble anything she could identify. One large containment cylinder stood against the far wall, its thick glass window revealing a dark mass floating inside murky liquid. Cherie leaned closer. The shape inside the tank had long since decomposed into an unrecognizable form. Jason examined the nearby control panel. Most of the switches were rusted into place. "Cold War Research Lab," he said quietly. Ross stepped into the doorway behind them. "Yes." Sherry turned toward him. What kind of research? Ross hesitated briefly before answering. Biological defense systems. Jason gave a short laugh. That's a polite way of saying bioweapons. Ross didn't argue. While Jason continued examining the old laboratory equipment, Sherry drifted toward a smaller side room connected to the main chamber by a narrow hallway. The door stood partially open, its hinges creaking softly as she pushed it wider. Inside, she found a compact observation room with a single wall of reinforced glass looking out into another containment chamber beyond. The room was empty except for a row of dusty chairs and an old monitoring console that had long since lost power. Cherie stepped closer to the glass. At first, she thought the surface had simply accumulated decades of grime. Then she noticed the patterns etched across it. Someone had scratched words repeatedly into the thick glass using something sharp enough to leave permanent marks. The same phrase had been carved over and over again until the letters overlapped in a chaotic web of jagged lines. Sherry leaned closer and read the words aloud under her breath. "Do not let it wake." Jason appeared in the doorway behind her. "That sounds encouraging." Sherry gestured toward the glass. "Look at this." Jason stepped beside her and studied the etched warning. The scratches were deep enough that whoever carved them must have spent hours working at the surface. "Who wrote it?" he asked. Ross entered the room and examined the message as well. His expression darkened immediately. "Someone who understood the risk," he said quietly. The overhead lights suddenly flickered. For a split second, the entire chamber went completely dark. Then the emergency lights sputtered back to life again with a weak red glow. Jason's head snapped toward the hallway outside the observation room. That wasn't good. Sherry felt the alien presence surge violently in her mind as the lights returned. Their fear had spiked instantly the moment the power fluctuated. One of them let out a soft clicking sound that echoed faintly through the chamber. Jason stepped into the hallway again, scanning the dimly lit corridor beyond. The larger chamber lay silent for several seconds. Then something moved. The sound came from deeper within the old facility, faint at first, like metal scraping slowly across concrete. Jason's grip tightened around the wrench again. "Tell me that's just old machinery shifting," he said. Ross remained silent. Sherry felt the alien minds recoil sharply again, their fear rising into something close to panic. "It's not machinery," she whispered. Jason looked at her. "Then what?" Sherry stared down the dark corridor where the sound had come from. "I don't know," she said. "But whatever it is, they think it's awake." Chapter 6. What Dugway Buried. Jason stepped slowly into the corridor beyond the observation room, his boots making dull echoes against the concrete floor as the weak red emergency lights flickered overhead. The hallway stretched deeper into the underground complex, branching into several narrow passages lined with reinforced steel doors that looked far heavier than the laboratory rooms they had already passed. Thick warning placards were bolted beside many of them, their faded lettering barely visible beneath layers of dust and corrosion. Sherry moved beside Jason, her eyes drifting across the strange symbols stamped into the metal surfaces, triangular hazard signs that didn't match any modern biological classification system she recognized. Ross followed a few steps behind them, studying the corridor with a troubled expression. The three aliens remained close together near the back of the group, their tall forms rigid as they scanned the shadows ahead. Sherry felt their fear vibrating faintly through her thoughts like a distant alarm bell. Jason stopped in front of one particularly massive door built from layered steel plates nearly a foot thick. The locking mechanism was enormous, a heavy wheel attached to a series of thick bolts embedded directly into the surrounding concrete. "That's not a lab door," Jason said quietly. Ross nodded grimly. "No." Jason ran his fingers across the faded lettering stamped into the metal surface. The words were barely legible but still clear enough to read. "Containment Vault B." Sherry felt another pulse of alien dread ripple through her mind as she stared at the door. Whatever lay behind it had terrified them long before the humans arrived in this place. Jason turned slowly toward Ross. "All right," he said, gesturing toward the massive containment door. "You're going to start explaining things now." Ross met his gaze without flinching. For several seconds, the only sound in the corridor was the faint buzz of the emergency lights overhead. Finally, Ross exhaled slowly. "Before the alien containment program was established at Area 51, he said, Dugway served as the primary testing site for several experimental biological defense initiatives." Jason folded his arms. "You mean bioweapons?" Ross nodded slightly. "Yes." Sherry glanced back toward the sealed vault door again. "And whatever they were working on down here needed something stronger than a normal containment lab." Ross's eyes moved toward the heavy steel door. "Correct." Jason leaned closer to the door, examining the locking mechanism. "So, what exactly did they lock away?" Ross hesitated. The pause was long enough to make Jason look back at him again. Ross finally spoke. "Some of the research programs conducted here were based on recovered biological materials." Sherry frowned slightly. "Recovered from where?" Ross's voice dropped a fraction lower. "From incidents that predated the alien containment program." Jason stared at him. "You're telling me Dugway was experimenting with alien biology before Area 51 even started holding prisoners?" Ross did not respond immediately, but his silence was answer enough. Sherry felt the telepathic contact surge violently the moment Ross finished speaking. The images arrived in a chaotic flood that nearly knocked her off balance. She saw the underground corridors of the complex decades earlier lit with bright white laboratory lights instead of the weak emergency glow surrounding them now. Researchers moved quickly through the hallways, wearing heavy protective suits. Armed guards stood beside thick containment chambers sealed behind reinforced glass walls. Then the images changed abruptly. A containment field flickered. A crack formed across the glass barrier. Something moved inside the chamber. Something that did not resemble any normal biological organism. The image fractured before Sherry could fully understand what she was seeing. Panic flooded through the alien minds again, overwhelming the rest of the vision. Sherry gasped and grabbed the wall beside her for balance. Jason stepped closer immediately. "What did they show you?" She swallowed hard. "Containment failure," she said. Ross's expression tightened sharply. "That can't be possible." Sherry shook her head slowly. "They've seen it before." Jason frowned. "Seen what?" Sherry looked back toward the sealed vault door behind them. "Whatever Dugway tried to lock away down here." They moved deeper into the corridor again, leaving the heavy vault door behind as the passage narrowed into another long stretch of concrete hallway. The red emergency lights flickered unevenly overhead, casting shifting shadows across the floor as they walked. Jason slowed slightly as he noticed something strange on the ground ahead. "Hold up." The others stopped. Jason crouched near the wall and aimed his flashlight toward the concrete surface. Dark streaks marked the floor in irregular patterns, as though something had been dragged through the corridor long ago. The stains were too dark to be rust. Sherry stepped closer and knelt beside him. "Is that?" Jason nodded slowly. "Blood." Ross's jaw tightened. The streaks continued farther down the hallway, disappearing around a bend in the corridor. Sherry felt the alien presence in her mind flare again with renewed alarm. The emotional signal they projected was unmistakable now. Not just fear, recognition. Jason followed the trail of dark stains with the flashlight beam. "Looks like something tried to get out," he said quietly. Ross shook his head once. "Or something tried to get in." Far behind them in the main tunnel system, the security teams advancing from the Nevada side were beginning to encounter their own problems. The radio chatter that had echoed steadily through the corridors earlier had started to change. "Hold on, did you hear that?" One voice crackled through a burst of static. Another soldier answered a moment later. "Negative. What are you talking about?" A third voice cut in abruptly. "Movement in the side corridor. I think we've got..." The transmission dissolved into a long burst of static before cutting out completely. A few seconds later, a different voice returned to the radio channel. Team 3, report status. No response came back. Then the voice spoke again, quieter this time. Did anyone else hear someone laughing? The corridor fell silent again as the transmission ended. Chapter 7. The Pursuit. Jason paused near the next bend in the corridor, raising a hand for the others to stop. The dim emergency lights above them flickered again as he tilted his head slightly, listening to the distant echoes traveling through the underground network. At first, the tunnel sounded empty except for the quiet hum of failing electrical systems. Then the faint sound of voices drifted through the corridor from far behind them, low bursts of radio chatter bouncing through the steel walls. Jason sighed quietly. They're gaining on us. Sherry felt the alien presence ripple with anxiety inside her thoughts, confirming the same realization. Ross stepped forward beside Jason and listened for a moment as well. The radio voices were still distant, but there were more of them now, overlapping in short, clipped transmissions. Search team advancing through Station 4C. Thermal contact likely ahead. Maintain spacing. Jason rubbed the back of his neck. They've got gear, radios, weapons. He looked toward the 3 aliens standing silently near the rear of the group. We've got a flashlight and a wrench, Ross said quietly. They won't stop pursuing. Sherry glanced at him. Because of the aliens. Ross hesitated. Yes. Jason shook his head. Then we need something that slows them down. He looked around the dim corridor again, studying the structure with the focused attention of someone who had spent years analyzing weak points in buildings and tunnels. And I think this place might give us exactly that. The corridor widened abruptly into a cavernous underground chamber filled with old industrial equipment scattered across the floor. Rusted rail carts sat idle along several branching track lines that split across the chamber like spokes on a wheel. Heavy tool cabinets stood against the walls, their drawers hanging open and spilling forgotten tools onto the concrete floor. Overhead, cranes hung from thick steel rails mounted along the ceiling, though most of their cables had long since seized with rust. Jason stepped cautiously into the center of the depot, his eyes scanning the machinery with growing interest. Now this, he said quietly, is useful. Sherry looked around the enormous room. Useful how? Jason pointed toward the rail tracks leading into the chamber. If we jam enough of this equipment across those lines, the security teams will have to slow down getting through here. Ross studied the chamber as well. You're proposing we create a barricade. Jason nodded once. Exactly. Sherry felt another ripple of tension pass through the alien minds. Their thoughts flashed brief warnings through her consciousness. Images of soldiers approaching the depot from the far end of the corridor. The pursuit teams were not far behind. Then we don't have much time, she said. Jason was already moving. Jason grabbed the handle of the nearest rail cart and shoved hard against the rusted metal frame. At first, the wheels resisted stubbornly against the tracks beneath them. Then the old bearings gave way with a screech of metal, and the cart began to roll slowly across the chamber. Sherry, help me with this one, Jason said. She stepped beside him and pushed against the side of the cart, while Ross dragged a second cart from the opposite track line. The 3 aliens moved with fluid efficiency through the depot, their long limbs gripping the heavy equipment with surprising strength. One of them lifted the end of a smaller transport frame entirely off the ground and carried it several feet before dropping it across the rail junction. Within minutes, the chamber had transformed into a chaotic wall of tangled machinery blocking the main path through the depot. Jason stepped back and wiped sweat from his forehead. That should slow them down. Sherry listened carefully for a moment. The distant radio chatter had grown louder now. The security teams were entering the older sector of the complex. Multiple tracks ahead. One voice reported through the tunnel echoes. Watch your footing. Jason picked up the wrench again and looked toward the exit corridor on the far side of the depot. Time to move. As Jason passed the nearest alien on his way toward the exit corridor, the creature suddenly reached out and touched his arm with its long, thin fingers. The contact lasted less than a second. But in that moment, Jason's vision exploded into something completely different. He was no longer standing inside the underground depot. Instead, he saw a vast night sky stretching over an ancient Earth thousands of years earlier. A massive object descended slowly from the stars, its dark shape glowing faintly as it fell toward the surface of the planet. Jason felt the presence of the three beings around him, not as enemies or prisoners, but as guardians escorting the descending structure. The object they carried was enormous, far larger than their small group could possibly control alone. The image shifted again. The structure rested now beneath layers of rock and earth deep inside the planet's crust. Massive containment barriers surrounded it, humming with energy fields designed to keep something inside from escaping. Jason saw one final image before the vision vanished, a crack forming across the surface of the prison. Then the depot returned around him in a sudden rush of reality. Jason staggered slightly and grabbed the wall to steady himself. Sherry turned immediately. "Jason?" He stared at the alien that had touched him. "You brought something here," he said quietly. The alien's large reflective eyes met his, and the emotion that flowed into Jason's mind was unmistakable. "Yes." Far behind them, the first security team rounded the final bend leading into the maintenance depot and immediately stopped short. Their flashlights swept across the tangled barricade of overturned carts and industrial machinery blocking the rail lines. One of the soldiers swore under his breath. "Obstruction ahead," he reported into his radio. Another soldier stepped forward cautiously, examining the barricade with the beam of his weapon light. "Looks recent." The team leader stepped closer to the pile of equipment. "Clear it." Several soldiers began climbing over the twisted machinery to start dismantling the obstruction. As they worked, one of them paused suddenly and tilted his head. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly. The others froze. Somewhere deeper in the forgotten wing of the underground complex, a faint sound drifted through the tunnels ahead of them. A slow scraping noise, followed by something that almost sounded like breathing. Chapter 8. The First Door. The corridor finally widened into a massive circular chamber carved directly into the rock beneath the desert. Jason slowed as he stepped into the room, the beam of his flashlight sweeping slowly across the towering walls. The chamber looked ancient compared to the rest of the underground complex. The concrete had been poured in thick, uneven layers decades earlier, and massive steel reinforcement ribs stretched across the curved ceiling like the skeleton of some enormous buried creature. But what dominated the entire space was the door. It filled nearly the entire far wall of the chamber, an enormous blast gate constructed from layered steel plates several feet thick, its circular shape framed by a ring of mechanical locking arms bolted directly into the surrounding rock. Faded warning symbols covered the metal surface. Some were standard radiation markers. Others were unfamiliar designs that looked far older than modern hazard systems. Jason walked slowly toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous chamber. "That," he said quietly, "is not something you build for a storage room." Sherry stood beside him, staring up at the enormous locking mechanisms arranged around the edges of the gate. "No," she said softly. Ross remained several steps behind them, his face pale beneath the dim emergency lighting. The three aliens had stopped near the entrance to the chamber, their tall forms rigid as they stared at the massive door with unmistakable urgency. Sherry felt the pressure in her mind return the moment she stepped closer to the massive gate. The alien's thoughts surged toward her again, this time carrying clear purpose rather than fear. Images flowed into her awareness, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. She saw the enormous chamber thousands of years earlier, the great door standing open while a massive structure rested in the cavern behind it. The structure glowed with faint energy fields that pulsed slowly across its surface. It did not resemble any machine Sherry had ever seen before. its geometry twisted in unfamiliar angles that seemed to shift depending on how she looked at it. The image shifted again. The three aliens stood before the structure, their tall forms preparing it for activation. A ripple of brilliant light spread outward from its surface. Then the vision faded. Sherry inhaled slowly as the telepathic contact withdrew. Jason studied her expression. "What's behind the door?" She looked back at the enormous blast gate. "Their way home," she said quietly. Ross stepped forward sharply the moment Cherie finished speaking. "No." Jason turned toward him. "No what?" Ross pointed toward the massive blast door. "That door cannot be opened." Sherry frowned. "Why?" Ross hesitated, the conflict on his face suddenly obvious. "Because the structure behind it wasn't just used for travel," he said slowly. Jason crossed his arms. "Then what else was it used for?" Ross looked toward the three aliens standing silently near the chamber entrance. "Containment." Sherry's stomach tightened slightly. "Containment for what?" Ross did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the door and ran his hand across the cold steel surface. "When the government first discovered this structure decades ago," he said quietly, "they believed it was simply an advanced alien machine." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. They were wrong." Ross nodded once. "Very." Sherry stepped toward the three aliens again, focusing her thoughts the way they had shown her earlier. The moment she did, the connection returned instantly. She projected a single question into the shared mental space between them. "What is behind the door?" The response came almost immediately. A flood of images surged into her mind once again, but these were far older than the memories of captivity she had seen earlier. She saw Earth thousands of years ago beneath a dark sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. The massive structure descended slowly toward the surface of the planet, guided by the three beings who accompanied it. But this time, Sherry saw what was inside. The interior of the structure contained something enormous, something that pulsed and shifted like a living shadow trapped inside a cage of light. Sherry recoiled slightly as the alien's message became clear. The structure had not brought them to Earth. It had come to remove something from it. She opened her eyes slowly. Jason watched her carefully. "What did they say?" Sherry swallowed. "That machine isn't their spaceship," she said. Jason frowned. "Then what is it?" Sherry looked back toward the massive blast door looming over the chamber. "It's a prison." For a moment she had the strange feeling that the structure had never been meant to lock something inside it. It had been meant to lock something out. Chapter 9. The Jailers. The words hung in the chamber like a physical weight. Jason stared at Cherie for several seconds before looking slowly back toward the towering blast door dominating the far wall. "A prison," he repeated quietly. Sherry nodded. The alien presence in her mind had grown calmer now that the truth had finally been spoken. The images they sent were no longer chaotic flashes of fear, but carefully arranged fragments of memory meant to explain what had happened long before humans ever discovered the underground chamber. She saw the ancient structure again descending toward Earth's surface thousands of years ago. The three beings guiding it were not explorers searching for a new world. They were escorts transporting something far more dangerous. The structure itself had been built specifically to contain the intelligence trapped inside it. When they arrived on Earth, the aliens had hidden the prison deep beneath the planet's crust, sealing it within layers of rock and energy fields designed to prevent the entity from ever escaping again. Sherry exhaled slowly as the final pieces of the story settled into place. "They weren't prisoners at Area 51, she said softly. "They were guards." Jason glanced at the three tall figures standing silently near the chamber entrance. "And we locked the guards in cages while we played with the prison." The next wave of telepathic contact arrived with a chilling clarity. Sherry saw the prison structure from the inside now, its glowing containment lattice holding something vast and shifting within its center. But the thing inside the structure did not have a stable shape. Its form rippled like a cloud of living shadow, constantly changing its outline. Sometimes it looked vaguely humanoid. Sometimes it stretched outward into branching tendrils that dissolved into darkness. Sherry felt the alien explanation forming carefully within the shared mental space. It does not live in bodies. The message carried with it a sense of ancient caution. It lives in minds. The images changed again. Sherry saw a distant civilization on another world long before humanity had even evolved. Cities burned beneath strange alien skies, while entire populations turned violently against one another under the influence of something they could not see. The entity had spread from mind to mind like an infection of thought, twisting perception and emotion until entire societies collapsed into chaos. Jason watched Sherry's face pale as the images unfolded behind her eyes. "Sherry," she swallowed hard before answering. "It's not a monster," she said slowly. "It's something worse." Ross stepped forward slowly, his eyes fixed on the enormous blast door. "When the structure was discovered during early underground testing operations," he said quietly, "the government believed it had uncovered alien technology of unimaginable power." Jason crossed his arms. "So they started poking it with sticks." Ross gave a small, humorless nod. "Essentially." Sherry turned toward him sharply. "You knew about this." Ross didn't deny it. "I joined the program years after the original discovery," he said. "But by then, the damage had already begun." Jason frowned. "What kind of damage?" Ross gestured toward the heavy blast door sealing the chamber. "The prison's containment systems were never meant to be tampered with. Human researchers believed they were studying an advanced energy source." He paused briefly. "In reality, they were slowly dismantling the lock on a cage." Sherry suddenly felt the alien presence surge again with urgent concern. The images flooding her thoughts now were different from the historical memories they had shared earlier. These were recent. She saw the underground corridors of Dugway filled with soldiers and researchers moving through the complex. Then something changed. Subtle at first. One soldier paused mid-conversation with a strange expression on his face. Another began laughing quietly to himself for no apparent reason. The images accelerated, arguments breaking out between co-workers, violent outbursts spreading through the facility. Sherry's eyes widened as the implication became clear. "It's already happening," she whispered. Jason looked at her sharply. "What is?" Sherry turned toward Ross. "The entity doesn't need a body to escape." Ross's expression darkened instantly. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." Far down the tunnel system behind them, the security teams clearing the barricade inside the maintenance depot were beginning to experience something strange. One of the soldiers suddenly paused while lifting a section of overturned machinery and tilted his head slightly as if listening to a distant voice. "You hear that?" he asked. Another soldier looked up from the rail cart he was dragging aside. "Hear what?" The first soldier frowned. "Someone laughing." The rest of the team exchanged confused glances. There was no laughter in the depot, only the grinding sound of metal being dragged across concrete. The soldier slowly lowered the piece of equipment he had been holding. "No," he said softly. "Not laughing." His expression shifted into something far more unsettling. Whispering. The other soldiers stepped back slightly as his smile widened in a way that did not look entirely natural. Chapter 10. The Thing in the Mind. A low vibration began to ripple through the massive chamber as the group stood before the ancient blast door. At first it was subtle, just a faint tremor in the concrete beneath their boots. Then the emergency lights flickered violently overhead, plunging the room into darkness for half a second before sputtering back to life again. Jason looked up sharply. "That's not good." Sherry felt the alien presence in her mind flare again with intense alarm. The images they projected came faster now, almost frantic. She saw the containment structure behind the door glowing brighter than before, the energy lattice surrounding the imprisoned intelligence flickering unevenly, as if something inside was pushing against it. Ross stared at the door with growing dread. The containment field is destabilizing. Jason glanced at him. You can tell that from here? Ross nodded grimly. The prison's power systems are tied into the rest of the facility's infrastructure. Sherry looked at the three aliens standing nearby. Their tall forms were rigid, their eyes fixed on the massive door with a mixture of urgency and fear. They think the entity is becoming aware of us, she said quietly. Jason exhaled slowly. Well, that's comforting. Far down the corridor network behind them, the security teams were no longer moving in an organized formation. The depot that had once echoed with the controlled noise of soldiers clearing the barricade had descended into confusion. One of the men had suddenly begun shouting accusations at the others, his rifle swinging wildly from one teammate to the next. "You're hearing it too," he yelled. Another soldier tried to calm him. "There's nothing there. Put the weapon down." The man's eyes darted around the dim chamber as if tracking invisible movement in the air. "You don't see it?" he whispered. "It's standing right behind you." The other soldiers turned instinctively. Nothing was there. When they looked back, the man had already fired. The gunshot echoed violently through the underground chamber. Moments later, several more followed as panic spread through the team. Radios filled with overlapping screams and static. The carefully coordinated pursuit had collapsed into chaos. Ross stood silently for several seconds while the distant echoes of gunfire rolled faintly through the underground tunnels. Then he spoke. "I helped them open it." Jason turned slowly toward him. "You what?" Ross ran a hand across his face. "Years ago, the research division I worked for was tasked with studying the energy output of the prison's containment system." Sherry stared at him. "You mean you tried to dismantle the lock?" Ross nodded once. "Yes." Jason's jaw tightened. "You realize we're standing here right now because of that?" Ross didn't argue. "I do." Sherry felt the alien presence shift uneasily in her mind as Ross spoke. They were listening closely now, watching the human responsible for weakening the prison that had held their ancient enemy for millennia. Jason shook his head slowly. "You spent years poking at something you didn't understand." Ross looked back toward the towering blast door. Humanity has always been curious about things it should leave alone. Sherry suddenly felt a new presence brush against her thoughts. Something colder and far more invasive than the telepathic signals she had received from the aliens. The sensation was faint but unmistakable, like a whisper slipping through the cracks of a sealed door. She gasped softly and grabbed the edge of the nearby control console for balance. Jason noticed immediately. "Sherry?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "It's trying to talk." Ross looked sharply toward her. "What do you mean?" Sherry pressed a hand against her temple as the strange presence moved through her mind like cold smoke. She heard a voice that was not exactly sound but carried meaning all the same. "You opened the door once before." The thought did not feel like language. It felt like something pressing gently against her memories. Sherry shuddered as the voice continued. "You will do it again." The alien minds surged immediately to push the presence away, forcing the invading thought back into the darkness beyond the chamber walls. Sherry staggered slightly as the pressure vanished. Jason caught her arm. "What did it say?" Sherry looked slowly toward Ross. "It knows who he is." Ross stepped closer to the massive blast door, studying the ancient control systems embedded into the surrounding wall. "The containment system can still be reactivated," he said quietly. Jason raised an eyebrow. "That's good news." Ross shook his head slowly. "Only from inside the chamber." Sherry felt the alien's agreement ripple through her mind. The images they projected showed the interior of the prison structure again, the glowing lattice of energy surrounding the entity at its center. But the activation controls were located deep within the chamber itself. Once the sequence began, the door would seal permanently. Jason looked at the enormous blast door, then back at Ross. "Meaning whoever starts it doesn't come back out." Ross nodded. Correct. For a moment, none of them spoke. The distant gunfire in the tunnels had stopped now. The underground complex had fallen into an eerie silence. Sherry felt the alien presence growing more urgent again. The entity inside the prison was pushing harder against its weakening cage. Jason finally exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that's going to make the next decision interesting. Chapter 11. Ash Root. The chamber had grown so quiet that Jason could hear the faint hum of the ancient containment systems vibrating through the floor beneath his boots. The towering blast door loomed above them, its thick steel surface reflecting the weak red emergency lights in dull streaks. Beyond that door, something older than human civilization strained against the failing cage meant to hold it. Jason looked from the door to the control panels embedded in the surrounding wall, then back toward the others. All right, he said quietly. This one's simple. Sherry shook her head immediately. No. Jason raised an eyebrow. You don't even know what I was going to say yet. Yes, I do, she replied. You're about to volunteer. Jason shrugged slightly. Someone has to. Ross stepped closer to the door, studying the faded control interface built into the rock beside the massive locking mechanism. The activation sequence will initiate a full containment reset, he said quietly. Once it begins, the door seals permanently. Jason nodded, which means whoever starts it stays inside. Sherry folded her arms tightly. Then we figure out another way. Jason gave her a tired look. There isn't one. The three aliens stood silently near the edge of the chamber, their tall forms illuminated by the dim red lights. Sherry felt their thoughts pressing urgently against her mind again. They understood the situation perfectly. They had faced it before on other worlds. The lights flickered violently again. A deep vibration rolled through the chamber floor as the containment structure beyond the blast door pulsed with unstable energy. Sherry felt the alien presence surge around her mind like a protective barrier just as the colder presence returned. This time, it did not approach her first. Ross suddenly staggered backward, grabbing his head with both hands. Ross! Jason stepped toward him. Ross's breathing had grown ragged. His eyes darted wildly around the chamber as though tracking something invisible moving through the air. I can hear it, he whispered. Sherry's stomach tightened. The entity was trying to reach him again. Ross had spent years studying the prison system. His mind was full of knowledge about its controls and weaknesses. Open the door. The voice slipped through Ross's thoughts like poison in water. Finish what you started. Ross dropped to one knee, his hand shaking violently. Jason grabbed his shoulder. Stay with me. Ross clenched his teeth and forced the words out through the pressure building in his mind. It's inside my head. Sherry focused all her attention on the aliens beside her. Their combined telepathic presence surged outward, forming a barrier that forced the invasive thoughts back. Ross sucked in a sharp breath as the pressure lifted slightly. Sweat dripped down his face as he looked up at the others again. It's getting stronger, he said hoarsely. Ross slowly pushed himself back to his feet, still breathing heavily from the psychic assault. He looked from Jason to Sherry, then toward the massive blast door once more. The decision settled across his face with quiet certainty. This is my responsibility, he said. Jason frowned. Ross shook his head. I helped weaken the prison. I spent years convincing people that the structure was just another piece of alien technology waiting to be understood. He gestured toward the door. If the entity escapes because of that mistake, every death that follows will be mine. Sherry stepped closer. You don't have to do this. Ross gave her a small, tired smile. Actually, he said, I do. He walked slowly toward the control panel embedded in the wall beside the massive blast door. The ancient interface flickered faintly as he brushed dust from its surface. The symbols etched into the controls were older than any human language, but Ross had spent years studying them during the government's attempts to analyze the machine. Jason crossed his arms. You're sure you know how to start it? Ross nodded. Yes. He looked back at them one last time. When the door opens, you run. Ross placed his hand on the activation controls. The chamber trembled as the massive locking arms surrounding the blast door began retracting with deep grinding sounds that echoed through the cavern. One by one, the thick steel bolts slid free from their sockets in the surrounding rock. Jason grabbed Sherry's arm and pulled her several steps back as the enormous door slowly began to rotate open. A blinding white glow spilled through the widening gap. The air inside the chamber changed instantly, humming with energy that vibrated through every surface. As the door swung fully open, the structure behind it came into view. The prison towered in the center of the chamber like a geometric monument built from pure light. Interlocking rings of energy rotated slowly around a core of shifting darkness trapped within their center. The entity inside twisted and folded against the glowing lattice as if testing every possible angle of escape. Sherry felt its presence immediately. The cold voice brushed against her thoughts again, stronger than ever. So many minds. The aliens moved quickly now, their tall forms gliding toward the far side of the chamber where the transport controls were embedded into the base of the structure. Jason grabbed Sherry's shoulder. Time to go. Ross stepped through the open doorway and moved directly toward the glowing control node at the base of the containment structure. The moment he crossed the threshold, the massive blast door began sliding closed behind him. Jason and Sherry ran toward the exit corridor as the aliens activated the transport system. The structure erupted with a surge of brilliant light that filled the chamber with blinding energy. Jason glanced back once just before the door sealed. Ross stood alone inside the chamber, his hand pressed firmly against the final control interface as the containment cycle began. The rotating rings of energy accelerated around the dark mass trapped within them. The entity's voice rose into a furious psychic scream that echoed through the underground complex. Then the blast door slammed shut. The ancient locking arms snapped back into place with thunderous finality. The prison had closed again. Sherry looked toward the ceiling, toward the world burning above them. "Jason," she said quietly, "I think we're already on the ash route." The underground chamber had finally fallen silent. The ancient blast door stood sealed once more, its locking arms fused into place by machinery that had endured longer than human history. Somewhere beyond it, the prison had closed around the thing that had waited for thousands of years in the dark. Above them, the tunnels collapsed one by one, burying the entire complex beneath miles of rock and desert sand. On the surface, the western United States burned beneath the spreading shadow of nuclear war. Cities smoldered, communications failed, governments fractured. Millions of frightened people searched for someone to blame in the ruins of the world they had built. Fear spread faster than the fallout. Anger followed close behind. And in that storm of human thought, quietly, patiently, something ancient began to listen. It no longer needed machines or chambers buried beneath the earth. It only needed what humanity had already given it. The prison door beneath the desert had finally closed. But the one inside the human mind was already opening. Thanks for listening to Ash Root. If you enjoyed the story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves sci-fi and horror. And drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from in the world and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Be sure to tune in for more stories like this right here on the channel. Until next time, thanks for listening.